And of course, we know that spending on sickness is a big story here today. Is on course to rise by 18 billion unless there's reform. More than the entire police budget, more than the budget of lots of areas as well. Liz Kendall, who's the Work and Pension Secretary, aims to reduce this by 5 billion. But of course, the problem she has, Labour MPs opposing the cuts, warning they could force hundreds of thousands into poverty. Despite the proposed changes, costs for major benefits like personal independent payments, PIP, are still projected to rise by 8 billion. Let's speak with Michael Simmons, economics editor over there at The Spectator. Michael, good afternoon to you.
Good to see you.
And listen, I mean, it's one of those areas, isn't it, this? I said at the very, very beginning, almost the most thankless job in government, you know, running the Department of Work and Pensions, because you're always going to deal with these kind of headlines. The same narratives are always there, you know, who is most in need, who doesn't need it, where do we cut, where do we increase, etc., which areas are most politically sensitive. Aside from all of that, the raw reality, Michael, is this is a bill that never goes down. Would that be fair?
Yeah, listen, certainly since the pandemic and since we've sort of changed our attitude to many things, specifically mental health, this is a bill and also a forecast of caseloads that just go up and up. It's not just that we're an ageing population. We seem to be a population that's becoming sicker and more invalided. At least that's what the evidence suggests with the amount of people that are claiming there's 1,000 people a day are being awarded these PIP payments. Even with these reforms, that, as you say, are meant to save 5 billion. The total benefits bill just for sickness alone, as you say, in 5 years' time will be 100 billion. And it's not that it stops there, you know, it's just that we only forecast for 5 years. There's no changes in the system that suggest that bill is going to come down over time.
Yeah, and the problem is there's two games being played. There's obviously the economics game, then there's the political game as well, because, you know, we all remember when the Tories under George Osborne sort of went down this route, and, you know, George Osborne might as well have been a member of the Nazi Party as far as, you know, many opposition MPs were concerned. They said as much at the time. This was the cruelest thing that had ever happened. Labour was shouting, squealing from the opposition benches, and here they are today, some of the same figures. Liz Kendall was certainly around at that time, doing the very same thing. There's sort of, I get, which leads you to believe there's a sort of inevitability around having to do something.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, like the NHS, the benefit system, especially since the Tories brought in universal credit, has become victim of what I would call the Ken Loach effect. Yes. When you make any, you know, reform to benefits, inevitably there are going to be some people who, you know, unfortunately, due to those changes, are going to find themselves in hardship. And then, you know, those of us in the press will jump on that and say, you know, this is terrible. What has the government done to these people? But I would say that we have to be quite realistic about this. And the risk, okay, politically, you want to avoid that right now. You're a Labour minister. You didn't come into politics to cut anything. Your backbenchers are not tolerating this, and your supporters are not tolerating this. But that situation is nowhere near as bad as if we let this bill keep climbing. We will eventually, you know, get to a point where it's a bit like hot potato. Whoever's in the DWP and whoever's in the Treasury at the year when the bill actually becomes unaffordable, by which I mean that the bond markets just don't tolerate us anymore,
sure,
then it's going to be a lot more than a few thousand people on benefits that end up in poverty. It's going to be all of us. So surely it's better to think long term and avoid that situation. Yeah. But the Labour Party don't seem to have the appetite for that.
I suppose, Michael, the other argument to all of this is that, because whenever we discuss, you know, where the line should be drawn on who's entitled to benefits, and when we're talking mostly about sickness benefits, there's all manner of other kind of benefits out there, of course. Underpinning that question, where do we draw the line, is that there are clearly some people who probably shouldn't be claiming or could better themselves if they really tried. Now, there is now a suggestion that actually that group is quite small, even though we like to think it's, you know, huge, and we all know the fella down the road who's had a permanent bad back for the last 30 years and never done a day's work in his life, etc., etc. But we're going to have to get used to the fact that we've just got iller. I mean, that would be the obvious reality then, in believing the current figures, that we genuinely are a sick nation and getting sicker by the year.
Well, I think we are getting sicker, but it's a lot of it is to do with our societal attitude towards sickness. I mean, I think you're totally right. There will always be a handful of people who genuinely are just trying it on. But even if you crack down on all of those people, it's not going to make a difference to the caseload. The numbers that worry me most are the amount of young people who are getting signed on to sickness, and they're predominantly getting signed on to sickness because of anxiety and depression. The reason why that's worrying is because once you go on to sickness benefit, your chances of returning to work are actually, quite slim. Now, if that happens to somebody with a bad back who's near retirement, maybe it's not that much of a, human tragedy.
Yeah.
But if we're talking, people between 18 and 25 go into sickness benefit, and they're not trying it on. They genuinely, believe that they don't feel well enough to work. If those people get stuck there for their entire working age, it's not just an economic tragedy, it's a human disaster.
Sure.
But that, I think, is something we can change. We can change how we look at mental health, and I think GPs would be keen to sort of have more support from government to say, look, yes, we're not saying you're trying it on. We accept that you're mentally having a tough time, but actually work is a good thing that might help your situation because it socializes you, it distracts you, etc. And I think on the mental health side of it, we need to have a conversation about how we view that as a society.
Yeah, totally. What's the word on the street, on the economic street, as it were, in this case, Michael? With other countries, similar sized economies, France, Germany, Spain, are they having a similar experience, and specifically on this area of mental health?
Right. Well, this is the sort of unanswered question, because it is certainly true that across the Western world, there's increases in this the mental health issue. There's a trend that actually started in America in about 2008. A lot of specifically young men just not finding work. Yeah. But what's really worrying is if you look at our overall economic inactivity, so people that are not just unemployed, but they also are not looking for work. That obviously spiked after the pandemic, as it did in many European countries. But Britain has had the sort of worst recovery back to the kind of towards the norm compared to anywhere in Europe, if not the developed world. Whereas countries like Poland sort of rushed back into work a lot more quickly. Now, I wish I knew what Britain was specifically doing wrong compared to these countries. Unfortunately, I don't. I don't know. And I don't think the government knows either. So that's an area that I think we urgently should be looking to find answers on.
Yeah, spot on. Listen, Michael, this is clearly going to be, for the government, a battle. They will probably win it because I think despite the rebellion from some of those backbenchers, they have a sizable majority, of course, that they'll get it through. But it is another kind of dent in the in the Labour Party. They had a few of these. Winter fuel allowance, I know they've done the U-turn on that. Grooming gangs, goodness knows what else. But this will be seen as, for many people, irreparable damage to the, if you like, the left-wing brand.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as I say, I don't envy, Liz Kendall, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer having to implement any of this. But I think realistically, since probably about 2010, we have been in a situation that is getting worse and worse, where because of these unsustainable costs that are coming down the line, and by the way, that's not just on sickness benefit, that's on things like student loan commitments, on local government pensions, on all sorts of things. Ultimately, the government exists to do a spring statement and a budget, and it's about trying to balance the books in a way that the bond markets are prepared to keep lending to us at near affordable prices. No government is going to be able to implement their true vision for a really reformed Britain, whether that be a left-wing Britain or a right-wing Britain, until we get ourselves onto a more stable financial footing. So I think obviously politically not what Labour politicians want to be doing, but they are also realistic, right? It's unescapable. These are choices that they're just forced to make by financial reality. Yeah,
I mean, I heard an economist a couple of weeks ago just say that, we've got another, this government will not experience the heady days of what Blair experienced. That's not going to happen in the tenure of Starmer's time in Downing Street. There's nothing on the horizon that would suggest there's going to be a big boom to the economy at any time soon.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's definitely reforms we could do to get us, more pro growth. Some of the stuff that Labour want to do on planning, for instance, I think is good, and some of the infrastructure and spending they want to do, I think, is also good. But none of these are quick wins, and in a way,
Sure.
this is a flaw in an otherwise brilliant system of democracy, right? Is that for the changes to really have an effect for Britain, you need to implement stuff now that we're going to reap the rewards of in 15 years. And unfortunately, politicians just don't think like that because they're thinking about how they get, re-elected in 4 years.
Indeed. Listen, Michael, thank you. Great to have you on. Really nice conversation with Michael Simmons, economics editor over there at The Spectator. I actually think there's something, and I've said this before, something completely different going on. And bear with us, Dave. I am going to be with you shortly. We're going to take a short pause and then we're back with Dave in Bournemouth. I think there's something else going on in terms of it's connected to the mental health thing. I don't dispute that some people who say they have a mental health problem, anxiety, depression, etc., I don't dispute those people think they have one. And I'm not, of course, including people who genuinely, demonstrably, and perhaps on an ongoing way have one. I mean, that's a kind of given. And I also understand that in the kind of weird world we live in, 21st century, money's short, cost of living, I don't doubt that number would increase. But I do think there's a sizable chunk of other people, mostly perhaps young people, who don't go to work because they don't feel like they can work, they feel down. But it's not because of just sitting there and making a random decision like, I don't want to work. It's actually a genuine feeling of, well, what am I working for? What am I going to get out of going to work? What am I going to earn? Where and how can I spend it? What will I get for the wages I earn? Will I ever be able to buy a house? You're 21, 22, thinking, how can my existence in the workplace ever translate to progression and success and an increase in my position? Now, of course, Anthony Robbins or Jeff Bezos or somebody would go, well, you've got to find your niche. And if you find your niche, then, you can exploit that and away you go. Not everyone's an entrepreneur. I would very rarely quote Ted Heath, but he used to make that point when essentially talking against what Thatcher became. When he was out of office, he said, not everyone's an entrepreneur. Most people are not an entrepreneur. So what about those people? There used to be a time when if you weren't that minded, you didn't want to start your own business, you didn't have a Dragon's Den idea in your head, but you did want to work and you wanted to work hard, and you knew if you worked hard at it could have been the local factory, could have been on the building sites. At some point you'll get the deposit together, you'll buy a house. Those days are gone. So that one fact alone, I sense, is a big issue around, worklessness, people not going to work, feeling depressed, might be a bit down. I just think I wouldn't describe it even as a mental health issue. I would just describe it as a pervasive lack of optimism that is snaking its way around the place, causing huge harm. I don't have massive sympathy with everyone in that position, by the way, but I think that's the reality. Tell me I've got that completely wrong, that's fine.